Thank you all so much for joining us today for this webinar on religion and the racial contract hosted by the Political Theology Network. This conversation was inspired by a series of scholarly reflections on Charles Mills and the legacy of the racial contract. And these reflections were written by our panelists tonight, among others, on the Political Theology Network website. Before we get started, I'd like to say a few words to introduce our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to Biko Mandela Gray, who's going to be facilitating the discussion for the remainder of the evening. First, I'll introduce Asaf Angermann, who teaches philosophy and Jewish thought at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. He is the author of Damaged Irony, Kierkegaard, Adorno, and the Negative Dialectics of Critical Subjectivity. He's the editor of Theodore W. Adorno and Gershom Scholem, Correspondence 1939 to 1969, and the translator from German to Hebrew of Adorno's Education to Maturity and Responsibility. His current work focuses on critical theory of race, gender, and sexuality, and on Black-Jewish relations. Next, we have Christophe Ringer, who is Associate Professor of Theological Ethics and Society at Chicago Theological Seminary and author of Necropolitics and the Religious Crisis of U.S. Mass Incarceration. He received his PhD in Religion, Ethics, and Society from Vanderbilt University. And his research interests include Black religion and cultural studies, social, theological, and philosophical ethics, public political theology, political philosophy, as well as the relationship between self, society, and the sacred. Dr. Holly Randell-Moon is a non-Indigenous lecturer in the School of Indigenous Australian Studies at Charles Sturt University, Australia. Her research focuses on whiteness, sovereignty, and settler colonialism, with a focus on the role of secular neutrality in obscuring the religious foundations of settler colonization in Australia. Next, we have Tommy Lynch, who is Reader in Political Theology at the University of Chichester in the UK. He is the author of Apocalyptic Political Theology, Hegel, Malibu, and Taubes. He also published on the construction of the category religion and its relationship to race in a purportedly secular Europe. Next, Dr. Uzma Jamil is Senior Research Equity Advisor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. She is a founding member of the editorial board of Reorient, the Journal of Critical Muslim Studies, as well as associate editor of the journal. Her research examines how Muslims are constructed as both racialized and religious minorities in the West, particularly in relation to whiteness and coloniality. She has published in leading journals in her field, including Ethnic and Racial Studies, Contemporary Islam and Islamophobia Studies Journal, on Muslims, Islamophobia, and Racialization in Quebec, the Construction of Knowledge about Muslims, and the Securitization of Muslims in the War on Terror. And finally, it's a pleasure to introduce our facilitator, Biko Mandela Gray, who is an assistant professor of religion at Syracuse University. His research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of philosophy of religion, Black studies, and religion in America. He is the author of Black Life Matter, Blackness, Religion, and the Subject, published by Duke University Press in 2022, and co-author with Ryan Johnson of the forthcoming Phenomenology of Black Spirit, published at Edinburgh University Press in 2022. He is also co-editor, along with Stephen Finley and Laurie Martin, of The Religion of White Rage through Edinburgh University Press 2020. So thank you all again for being here. I'm so excited for this conversation with our panelists here today. And Biko, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Laura. And I just got to give a real big thanks, real big shout out to Laura for helping to organize this and having my back when things turned and scheduling all of us to be together at the same time. Look, it is going to be, I think it's going to be a really interesting and powerful conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into this. The way this is going to work for the webinar attendees is that I'm going to ask each person just to give us a couple of minutes to talk about what they contributed to these particular to this particular conversation on the Political Theology Network's website. I'm going to read just a bit of my contribution just to set the stage. Is that okay with everybody? I'm only looking at the panelists, so I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs just to set the stage for how we might think about Charles Mills's work. And then I'm going to pass it over and we're going to play the eeny, meeny, miny, mo thing because we're on Zoom. So I'm just going to like close my eyes and pick on someone to go ahead and get us started. So what I'll do is I'll just read a couple of opening paragraphs that I thought might help for those of us who are not familiar with Mills's work or who are not necessarily familiar with what we were doing in this particular conversation. I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from what I had written. The year was 1997, and Charles Mills set out to lay the record straight. And with an opening like this, in other words, an opening like white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today, it was clear Mills was not interested in obliquely addressing the issue at hand. 25 years later, and on the anniversary of Mills's passing, such a claim, as Charles Mills himself noted, might not seem that outrageous. Perhaps this is the case because Mills had said it. Not alone, of course. Mills was part of a cadre of intellectuals in the mid to late 90s who was committed to laying bare the violence and continued presence of white supremacy. The statement's waning shock value, again, this statement, white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. This statement's waning quote unquote shock value then might be understood as a testament to Charles Mills's work. But just because a statement, an argument, doesn't shock as it once did, doesn't mean that it is any less powerful or precise. When a discipline by and large still, and I mean philosophy here, when philosophy by and large still fails to address fully the racialized and racist foundations of its history and development, saying the quiet part out loud becomes and remains necessary. It was 1997 after all. And though we might quibble on what or whether progress has been made in both the field of philosophy and our larger socio-political context, white supremacy is still foundational to the world. Breonna Taylor was killed in her sleep, George Floyd on camera. Haiti remains a site of dispossession, and recently a Black woman professor was publicly and widely maligned for speaking out about Queen Elizabeth II of England's continued overseeing of the British colonial regime. Mill's opening salvo about white supremacy may not shock many of us now, but it was part of a large community of Black scholars and scholars of color who refused to keep quiet about white supremacy, and in so doing, encouraged and empowered others to continue to do the same. The quiet part still needs to be said out loud. And what I love about not necessarily my words, but about Mills's words is that quiet part that he says out loud about white supremacy opens up the capacity for many of us to begin thinking differently. And so with this in mind, I'm going to just go around. I would love to start with Asaf. Is it Asaf or Asaf? I want to make sure I pronounce it right.
Thanks, Asaf.
Asaf. I want to start with Asaf, and I want to hear how I want you to meditate on what you wrote in your particular piece, in large part because you asked some profound questions about identity and being forced into particular sites of what we might call white privilege. But go ahead, I'm following. You go ahead and do your thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you again for organizing that. And I think I have more questions than answers, and more questions than even arguments. And I might even just connect to what you just said, because I really appreciate the introduction and the statement about the quiet part and things kind of speaking out, the things that have been unsaid. And I think so maybe my question has two dimensions, one more the philosophical one about the unsaid and the quiet part, which is at the same time kind of, that's something that really strikes me in the racial contract, quite a total statement, an absolute statement. There is no way out of the racial contract, whether you take side, whether you think you take sides or not, you have taken sides. That means there is no way out, and it's kind of a poetic structure. That means even if you think you're not part of the racial contract, whatever side you take, you have taken part. And the question is, what does it mean to be part of like such a total system, absolute system? on the one hand, so that's kind of the statement that he makes. There is no way out. Either you are on the side of the, he says, specifically, he speaks about all whites being beneficiaries of the contract, though not all whites are signatories. What does it mean to be part of something, part of a contract that you haven't signed? That means even if you are opposed to it, you still benefit from it, on the one hand. On the other hand, the question is, it seems to me that the racial contract has, and maybe that's the strength of his argument, very kind of not really transformative, but transforming sense, or there is some fluidity. That means whether on what side you are standing depends where you are, depends on the social and historical situation. And what I personally found really interesting is how people can be in different times on different sides of the racial contract. That means, and that leads, so that's the philosophical side and maybe the more concrete side. And I was asking that from kind of a Jewish perspective. What does it mean to be at some time in history on the side of the oppressed? And Charles Mills has very interesting things to say also about Jewish history, which were quite provocative, but I think it's something worth thinking about. What does it mean to be at some point of history on the side of the oppressed, and then to some extent, deliberately or not, intentionally or not, being on the side of the oppressors? That at least kind of consenting deliberately, knowingly or not, and there is no way to consent to something unknowingly, consenting to white supremacy. And that's the question. So that's kind of the second part of the question. How could have Jews ever consented to white supremacy? And I think being that on that part of the racial contract without doing much against it means, in some sense, consenting to white supremacy. So these are the questions, and I have no real answers to them.
Those are incredibly powerful questions, though. Questions that I think let me not hop in here and get excited, because I was going to go ahead and go down that road, and I want to give everyone a chance to reflect as well. But your questions that you raise are questions that precisely at the intertwining of Charles Mills's work and questions of religion and race and the racialization of religion, right? And this brings in Professor Uzma Jamil, who lays claim to this idea that religion can, particularly Islam, can be racialized. So I would love to hear your reflections on how you're seeing the racial contract. Asaf, keep that question in mind, because there are resonances between what you're doing, what Dr. Jamil is doing, and what Dr. Ringer is doing with social death. But I'm going to come back to that in a bit. So keep that in mind.
Thank you. Thank you, Biko. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So even just in the moments like right now where you've pointed out a few things, a few things just resonate with me, I think, very, very quickly. One, I think the fact that it is foundational, so that the racial contract is foundational to society. What does that mean for Muslims? If we're thinking about them as racialized and religious minorities in the Western context. So that's really the bigger picture of the work that I'm doing and that I'm interested in. And specifically within that, what are the overlaps between whiteness and coloniality? And in both the past and the present, and how do we locate Muslims within this history around the racialization of religion? So thinking about the construction of Europe as Christian and white vis-a-vis the Moors, which were Muslims and Jews, were sort of constructed as one kind of racialized religious other. And also thinking about it in terms of the discourse that we use to talk about Muslim subjectivity. So connecting the framework of white supremacy and that racial hierarchy that Mills talks about with the critique of Orientalism that Edward Said talks about, and the ontological divide between the Occident and the Orient. And lastly, in terms of thinking about the globality of white supremacy and the racial contract as sort of ordering how we think about the relationship in the present, particularly in North America and in Canada, in my context, between white majorities and Muslims. And so how do we go from sort of the very specific, which is the Quebec society context that I talk about in my blog post, but actually it's simply a microcosm of the larger globality of thinking about white supremacy and its relationship to racializations and to Muslims beyond one particular national context.
there's so much richness. I'm writing, so if my head is down, it is because I'm writing and thinking through these things. Again, we're just going to transition right on smoothly over to the next thinker before I start interjecting. One of the things that I'm processing is this connection of whiteness with Christianity, and therefore sort of racialization that becomes operative. One of the things that Tommy Lynch and the lines have been messing with me. This notion of whiteness as Theodician. And I would love to hear you sort of riff about that in terms of what you wrote in your post. Because if I won't do that, I want to hear from you first. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this and for you put it into getting all this questions. Yeah, no, I think I'm really interested in theodicy as foundational for thinking about political, and that, and so Adam Kotzka in his book on neoliberalism, legitimate.
Oh goodness, I think we might have lost them.
Is always.
Oh,
am I back?
Kinda, you're back. Oh goodness. Okay, I think you're back now. Okay, yeah, so you're back now. Go ahead. So you were saying theodicy, Kotzko, go ahead and do your thing.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes, so this idea that one of the questions for political theology is how political systems justify our experiences of suffering and evil, and I think Mills kind of lays bare all the dimensions of suffering that we experience, particularly under the kind of the good framework of liberalism, and exposes them in ways that are so sort of succinct and precise. Political theology, at least kind of historically, has this suspicion of liberalism, but it's often very kind of vague suspicion. It's sort of liberalism is just a term for the status quo. And one of the things I've always found very beneficial in Mills's work is just how unsparing he is in his reading of liberalism, even as he wants to defend a particular form of Black radical liberalism. And for me, kind of thinking about Mills's work, like some of the questions really resonate with what Uzma was just saying. I mean, like, for one, like, what does it mean to read Mills in a kind of global sense, and particularly outside of the United States? I'm American originally, but I live and work in the UK. And it's very easy for people in other parts of the world to see racism as an American problem mainly, and then it echoes in our societies as kind of echo of what's happening in the American situation. And so when I teach Mills, it's often easy for students to see that in American society, but difficult for them to see it in their own, which I think is precisely one of the benefits of his essay on white ignorance, is that it exposes the kind of mechanisms by which we get trapped in this sort of theodical way of thinking, of justifying the systems under which we live.
I love it. I'm here for it. I'm thinking about, we're talking about globality, we're talking about theodicy and political theology, and what it's also raising for me, I believe it was Holly's essay, raising for me questions about the notion of the West as secular, and how do we begin to think about that? I'm not asking you to do this work right now, Holly. I want to say that up front, but I'm interested in how you think about the secular, I think you call it the secular contract in your piece, in relation to this discourse of theodicy that Tommy is talking about, right? There seems to be, what I loved about all of these pieces, that there seem to be certain intersections between what all of you all were doing in different ways. And Holly, I would just love to hear you riff a little bit about how you see this operative in terms of discourses of secularism as well. And then the way the rotation is set up, we'll get to Christophe. Go ahead.
Thank you, Biko, and thank you to Laura for organising the webinar as well. I'd also just like to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Wiradjuri peoples on whose land I'm zooming to it's morning in Australia, but I think it's evening where you are, and pay respects to elders past, present, always. And we do an acknowledgement of country in Australia to challenge the epistemic ignorance around the racial contract and the way that the Australian state was founded in negation of already existing Indigenous sovereignties. And what I do in my blog piece is read Mills in relation to settler colonisation and epistemic ignorance in Australia. And I draw on both Mills and Eileen Morton Robinson to develop this idea of the secular contract and that contracting into a secular liberal state like in Australia, what you're doing is kind of obscuring the racialized and religious foundations of the state and the way that the state was founded through the negation of Indigenous sovereignty. And some of the ways this epistemic ignorance sort of plays out is that the state can represent itself as secular and neutral with respect to religion, despite the fact that there's obvious intersections between religion and the secular state. Australia is a constitutional monarchy, so we have representatives of the Queen in each state and federal parliament. The Constitution opens with a preamble that mentions Almighty God, and the Crown possession is actually the legal authority in Australia. So contracting into that secular into the secular contract is to on the one hand, you have this relationship between Christianity and whiteness in relation to the secular state, but at the same time, the state sort of reproduces this idea that of neutrality in relation to religion and some of the kind of racialized and religious dimensions to this secular contract, I think, played out recently in relation to the death of the Queen, when some Indigenous peoples sort of spoke out about the fact that, like, okay, we're mourning the Queen, but like the Queen has a relationship to Crown possession, the Queen has a relationship to colonisation, and I think that touches on some of the points that you mentioned, Biko, in your introduction to the blog posts, and some of the points that Tommy was making as well.
Thank you for that. I'm thinking about how neutrality operates as a sort of hidden normative good. And it keeps having me think about Tommy's work, right? That there's a certain way. So there's a connection here. It just so happens that the person I'm turning to last is not by any means least. I just want to share for folks in the webinar, we went to school together back in the day. I view him as a kind of older brother in certain ways, because he was doing what I'm doing long before I was doing it, because he was a beast. And so I want to transition over in large part because on the one hand, Christophe, I see your work. I see your work is resonating with other folks' work on the panel, but you make a turn. And the line that turns it for me is, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you say the racial contract is a death contract. And I'm not going to go so far as to say we in Afro-pessimist territory, but I'm wondering, what workers through that a little bit, because while we're seeing the expansion of the racial contract with many of the other thinkers on the panel, what you do is look on the flip side of the folks, right, the folks who are like not simply excluded from the contract, but who are literally made to die in and through the signing of the contract. So I'm interested just to hear you meditate a little more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Biko. And thank you for this invitation, Biko and Laura. And Biko's making me feel a little bit old right now. So I'm
My bad. I didn't mean it that way.
Long ago, right?
I meant it in a nice way.
You did. I guess, so what I'd like to do is, as a way of easing into that, part of what I've been thinking about is kind of on two fronts. One, as it relates to social death, but then also two, this question of epistemological ignorance.
Yeah.
And the way in which, I'm thinking a lot about the way in which religion can sacralize that ignorance. And does religion then kind of take that epistemological ignorance
Come on now.
and bring it into a kind of circulation, right? Especially for traditions that may lay claims to special kinds of knowledge, right? Through revelation, etc. And then do the values and virtues produced by religion then come to become active agents in the reproduction of the contract, right? So there's the ways in which the critiques of forgiveness and grace operate kind of in real time around issues of Black death. And then so when you think about, and here, the idea of anti-Blackness as a form of bad faith, again, I think Mills then kind of augments this work of Gordon, so that it's not only this existential point of desiring a pleasing falsehood and disavowing an unpleasing truth, but the social reproduction of that, right? Yes. And then when you begin to look at whether it's Ruth Wilson Gilmore in the production of premature death, and Orlando Patterson, now, the racial contract, right, is inseparable, I think, from those figures. And so I think that part of what Mills's work, and thank you, Uzma, for the for a little grammatical issue. I used to say Mills, now I know it's Mills is. Part of what he gets us, one, he moves us beyond the impasse between kind of non-ideal theories and ideal theories, right? So you have this rich kind of philosophical work that we can engage politically in real time. And I think you're right to kind of raise this question of Afro-pessimism, because I think what Mills does with the language of contract, there's an opening in terms of resistance, because contract still opens us to the idea of social agreements rather than a kind of ontologizing of social death that we have in some versions of Afro-pessimism. But I also use Mills's work to think about questions of sacrifice, right? The sacrifice of non-white populations to sustain the very existence of white populations. So it's not only is it this question of over other populations, right? But their ongoing sacrifice. And so the religious kinds of significations on that, I think, are really rich. And I also have been thinking about eschatology as a category that integrates issues of time, space, and judgment, and how the racial contract globally, right, allows us to think both historically about concrete places and the kinds of normative judgments we render on populations, but then also can it open up to different future possibilities, right? Can it help us to see something otherwise, if you would?
This is also rich for me. I'm excited, and I have so many ideas running around. Perhaps the best place to start, best is not probably the place that I want to start here is this. Christophe, you're saying that the contract, because Mills articulates it as a contract, there remains a possibility for its change, right? Is what I hear you saying, sort of counter, like over and against the ontologized claims of the Afro-pessimist, right? Wilderson is a perfect example of this. We don't need to go into a whole bunch of details, but for Wilderson, there's structural barring. I'm wondering, Tommy, we're going to come to you real quick. But when you talk about theodicy, it does feel ontologized. And so I'm wondering, how would you think with the sort of malleable, like if a contract is signed, perhaps it can be unsigned, or perhaps it can be torn up, perhaps. And I'm wondering, but the way that you discuss theodicy, I'm wondering, how might you think about the possibilities for tearing things down, or is this an ontologized structure?
Yeah, I'm a little bit the kind of jury's out on the question of ontologization for me. I find these debates very interesting, but the kind of space that I sort of keep coming back to is to what extent is the signing of a contract the definition of the signees or the people who are excluded from signing the contract, so that the contract itself is, the parties are defined by the contract. They don't exist prior to the contract. And I think reading Mills alongside a whole host of people, whether it's Denise Ferreira da Silva, Sylvia Winter, people like that, the question becomes, to what extent is the racial contract just the foundation of something like the world? And if the racial contract is definitive of the world in which we live, and this is getting into that kind of eschatological territory that Christophe was just mentioning, then I think that the racial contract, there is a kind of hopefulness to Mills, which I always struggle with. Like when I read his kind of reworking of the Black radical liberal tradition, I think, well, that sounds very good, but like I have that nagging suspicion that actually this is an attempt to define a contract in a world that's already been defined by the racial contract, and that we can never arrive at a new contract without first destroying the world or witnessing the destruction of the world defined by the racial contract, which he so insightfully analyzes.
It's so interesting that you bring this up, because now I'm thinking, we're coming back to you, Asaf. Also, I want to say this. Y'all can all hop in here whenever y'all want to. We've all done the formal work at this point. It's a conversation, but I'm just here to just keep things going if absolutely necessary. But it's all, if I gotta say first, Tommy, you starting to sound similar to someone like, Frank Wilderson. There's a certain way in which the destruction of the world, and I don't mean this in a shady way. I want to be clear. I mean this in a analytic way, that Wilderson's might make a claim along those lines that, the way this thing is completely and totally structured from the very beginning, we got to destroy this thing. And, Wilderson doesn't go too much further than that. We just got to destroy this thing. But other folks are wondering, well, destroy this thing and perhaps open up to something otherwise, as Christophe and Sean Crowley often sort of think about. And so I'm thinking about that as I'm listening to you, and I'm in conversation with you all now. I'm moderating, but I'm also really thinking through these things. But it also raises this question of, I felt a kind of how do I say this, Asaf? I felt that you felt a bit constrained by the logic of the racial contract. And I'm wondering, after listening to everybody else, like how are you thinking about those questions now, right? I have thoughts, but I'd rather hear yours, because I dwell with mine all day. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would go all the way and say that for Mills or for myself, it's only about either destroying the whole thing or just kind of submitting to it. But I think, so it's really a question, but I think the strength of his argument and the problem is that we can't just remove the signature. So we can't just say, I wasn't part of the signing and I'm out of it, I'm against it, because basically if I'm benefiting from something, then I'm part of it. And that makes it much more complicated to oppose it. That's really an obstacle to resistance. And that also connects to what Christophe just talked about, the idea of religious supremacy or religious superiority. I am part of, the decision whether I am part of a superiority or supremacy is very substantial for questions of life and death. So if I haven't signed it, but I'm benefiting from it, then not benefiting from it would be kind of signing my own, or any one of us, our own death. And so it's also kind of, I'll just say it briefly, but another aspect of my reflection was also about immigration and the idea of being a minority in a different country. That means when you're immigrating to a place, you are almost by definition accepting the rules of the social contract. That means you need to sign it. And that leads in many cases to the fact that minorities who have in some place, in some part of history, have been oppressed, have been racialized minorities, would suddenly be on the other side, whether they want it or not. That means would be on the side of religious supremacy or white supremacy in order to survive. And I think, again, that's the strength of Charles Mills' argument, but that's also why there is no way out. What should I give up my signature and die? That's why
it's Uzma, do you want to hop in here? do we give, yeah, it's a powerful question, Asaf. Yeah, I mean, I'm reading Lee Edelman's work, No Future, right now, and thinking about the death drive. So there's a certain way, and also, but yes, if you would like to hop in, Holly, if you would like to hop in, I'm thinking about both of you right now, but I want to formally just make sure you all are welcome, and I want to hear what you're thinking in terms of this conversation.
Thank you. So actually, I'm interested in hearing what you all are, where you're going with this conversation. I think just what comes to mind to me right now is the fact that we all are complicit and involved already. So there isn't an opportunity, there isn't a place where we can stand and say, I am not part of this. We're all like sort of on a spectrum of it. I think the question is, how do we live within the space that exists where we are? And I think that's a constant ongoing work, in terms of thinking about subjectivity and how subjectivity is always created in relation to something else, like to an external, whoever that external might be. It doesn't exist all sort of, on its own, in its own little bubble. So, I mean, I think I want to say that, but I would like to hear maybe from others and keep this conversation going.
I'm thinking with you, and complicity, it keeps, I thought about this when, Holly, when you were talking initially, and I got two questions for you, and then I'll stop, like really trying to, because I'm really processing what y'all saying, like super hype. Complicity and neutrality feel like bedfellows to me in a certain way. So I'm thinking about that, but I'm also wondering, how might you respond to Asaf's question? Do you feel as if, given that the secular contract plays nice while being nasty, do you think there's do you think there's a way out of this? If the state has gotten in on the game, which is to say, if the state is playing the game on different terms, but it's still a game of brutality, is there a way out based upon your vantage point? I'd love to hear more.
I'm thinking about everybody's points and what people are raising in relation to the racial contract, and can it be changed, and how is the racial contract linked to differential privilege and disadvantage and death for people who contract into the racial contract. In the context of Australia, for a long time, Indigenous scholars have pointed to the destructive impacts of settler colonisation, and some of that scholarship and some of that work, I think, is starting to get a reception from non-Indigenous people, because we're starting to see the impact of monocultural farming on environmental destruction and the lack of sustainability, on drought, on water shortages and food shortages. So I think there's perhaps scope there to kind of think about, well, is the racial contract that underpinned settler colonisation, is that sustainable? Is that linked to a whole range of social and literal death? And from a non-Indigenous perspective, a way of thinking about contracts is through custodianship in relation to country. So from an Indigenous perspective, country and land contains spirituality, culture, law, and that contract or that custodianship that you have with country changes, because as country changes, as the environment changes, you change. So it's a different way of thinking about contracts, not as something that's just sort of like set in stone and that can't change. It's a way of thinking about our relationship to the environment changes, and it impacts on our livability in particular ways. So that might be a way of thinking about a new kind of contract that's livable and sustainable, and that can be changed in comparison to the racial contract, which is really difficult to change, and perhaps perhaps environmentalism and sustainability might be a way into getting rid of that contract.
Does anyone else have any thoughts? Because go ahead, Christophe.
So I really appreciate both Uzma and Holly, your turn to kind of the question of relationality, because the other figure that that I think about quite often with Mills is Abdul John Muhammad and his work, The Death-Bound Subject. At the very end of his book, he begins to take this turn that in some way Mills foreshadows a little bit, because he wants to bring this kind of tradition of the master-slave dialectic into conversation with Patterson. And at the very end of his book, he says, I don't have space to do it, but what has to be done is the reworking of a death contract. Right, so it's not so much that there's a way out, but there could be a way through. And the way through is for him to risk one's own life, right? To put one's own death back on the table and to renegotiate the contract itself. Now, I don't think one needs to be that dramatic, if you will, right? I think there can be all kinds of concrete everyday negotiations, right? Forms of resistance that can, over time, chip away at, right? Without any kind of romantic notions of, what's possible. But I think there are openings, right? But the openings are created not by assuming there's a way out, but that it is always being negotiated.
So no way out, but through.
Mm-hmm.
Through negotiation.
Or maybe what some will call kind of a certain, it's, I'm losing the technical term, but a kind of agonistic politics. Where you're not assuming progress, you're not assuming there's no grand narrative, there is the ongoing renegotiation.
There's no telos. Yeah. I'm the reason why I'm stuck, and I would love to hear other folks hop into this, the reason why I'm stuck is because, like, how do we think about, how do we do that without fatal, like, not necessarily fatalism, that's not the right word, but this is actually a question I was dealing with my students earlier, and asking them about a non-teleological hope, right? What do you do? Like, how do, and I've heard someone here say that Mills is profoundly hopeful. I think it was you who said this, that Mills is profoundly hopeful in this text. But part of his hopefulness, and this is just me hopping in, part of his hopefulness, I feel like, and I let me be clear, all props. We always give praises and honor to the people who pass, give them their flowers. But part of the hopefulness I struggle with, because number one, I'm not sure. Like I hear a Black radical politics of refusal in what you're saying, Christophe. I do, right? What I hear in Mills is a Black radical liberal, and I don't know what that means. Like, in the sense of, like, how do you hold liberalism and radicalism in, right? And maybe that's unfair to say. Look, I'm not a John Rawls scholar, so I want to be clear. But I'm wondering, Tommy, Uzma, Holly, Asaf, Christophe, like, how do we think about this question of hopefulness in light of what feel like the stark terms of the racial contract? How does one hold a hope? This is a concrete, like, I know we're here to do academic work, but this is a question I encounter with my students often. How do we think about, given the terms in which we find ourselves, the world within which we find ourselves, what does it even mean to engage in a politics of hope in light of the starkness of the racial contract? Anyone can hop in. Just unmute yourself and feel fancy free. Laura, I just want to make sure we're right on time, so just shoot me something in the chat to make sure. But I saw hands, so go ahead.
Yeah, I would hesitate to see it as fully philosophy or theology of hope. I would hesitate to talk about hopefulness in Mills, but rather I think what he's doing is kind of label, like the small steps that we need to take in order to dismantle supremacy. And that's what actually he's doing. So he's kind of dismantling the supremacy in the foundations of European philosophy. So looking at Kant, looking at Hegel, looking at Wallace, and looking at the racial contract, the way it is formed legally, and kind of dismantling it step by step, showing where the oppression is, how the racism operates. And I think it's a different kind of, so it's not hopeful, but it's not, so I'm concerned about, like, kind of empty hopefulness, just having a utopian hopefulness. And that's not what he's doing. He's actually acting, and it's more like a philosophy of practice. And that's the label that I see in his work.
I don't think, I want to be clear. I don't think it's a superficial hope. So I don't think that he's being superficial. What I'm processing is exactly like when I think about the racial contract, and I love that Holly articulated a different modality of contract, something that we might call, in my little like Kojic place, covenant, right? A certain set of agreements that we might like work through and that might change over time as we continue to grow. But this racial contract feels, and this is just me hopping in here and thinking with you all, it feels set in stone. There's a certain way it feels like. That's why I keep coming back to Tommy's ideas about theodicy, and because I know you don't want to go to the ontological. I understand that, Tommy. I recognize that that's not what you want to do, but when we go to the level, I'm thinking about William Jones. I don't know if you know him, but William Jones. I'm thinking about William Jones right now, and William Jones is clear. Like the only way around this, right, is to either completely get rid of God, which in this case would mean to get rid of. To fight like hell to get rid of this contract in any way, not just chip away, right? Like, you know, to the potential possibility of one's own death, fight like hell to get rid of it. Or he says to completely drain the thing, in the case of Jones, drain God of all God's power, which is to say, in this case, to render the contract null and void, which again, in this particular case, would be at the risk of death. So I'm thinking about the racial contract in relation to theodicy, in relation to these questions of hopefulness. But now I'm thinking about William Jones in relation to all this, Tommy. And I want to know, what's going through your head, in terms of this?
Yeah, I haven't thought about William Jones in relation to Mills. That's really interesting. But I mean, kind of coming back to this question of hopefulness, which I think is a related question. I mean, one of the people I've often thought about in relation to Mills is George Yancey. And he's got the book Look a White. And I find that there's something in Yancey. I think that juxtaposition of their bodies of work identifies this kind of hopefulness that I see in Mills. Whereas, Yancey is so kind of unsparing about the desire he sees in his white students to become a good white, and his just refusal. He just says, like, you can't be a good white. And so whatever our practice looks like, to use the language that Asaf was using, it can't be predicated on a logic which is seeking the good that comes out of suffering. Or that I can become good by subjecting myself to suffering. Because even if I as a white academic sort of find ways of becoming more vulnerable to the violences of the world, which other people experience in a much more immediate sense, I'm still a signatory to the racial contract. Like, I'm just doing that of my own volition. If I get tired of it, I can jump back out and be like, no, I'm back on the white side. Like, it's all good. And I think it's that where we started, really, that like we are signatories to the racial contract, and that operates differently for different groups of people. But we can't get out of the racial contract, even in the process of working to dismantle it. And it's that, I mean, I think I tend to go more towards the ontologization precisely for that reason, because it's not just ideological. That's another great thing in Mills. I mean, one of the lines that's always kind of stayed with me is in the White Ignorance essay, where he says that a critique of whiteness requires an ability to talk about objectivity, truth, facts, kind of old-fashioned terms that aren't very much in vogue. But there is something like the racial contract is material. It structures the world in so many profound ways. And even if we change the way that we think, it doesn't change the fact that the world has been profoundly organized. People's lives and deaths have been organized by that contract.
This is the question that I constantly circle back and forth around, not simply with Mills, but just in my position as a philosopher of religion, balancing between the profound structuration of the racial contract, which now has been articulated in many different ways, right? I think in a certain way, and I've said this multiple times during this webinar, that that I see, certain iterations of Black studies is drawing from this, even as they may not agree with everything that Charles Mills is doing. And yet I want so badly to hold out. And this is what I hear, Uzma, this is what I hear you saying in a certain way, is holding out for the possibilities of certain kinds of makings of life, how we might make life, even as we are on the one hand signatories, beneficiaries of these racial contracts, and yet at the same time we suffer from them. So if you can just share a little more about how you see, this praxis, what it sounds like. If I remember, if I was following you when you were speaking earlier, there might be a way that people make lives in the midst of this, and I'm just wondering, how might you see that? If you see it that way at all. I could have put words in your mouth, and I am so sorry. That's not what I meant. That's what I heard. So
No, I think actually you've framed it in a little bit of a different way, but that is the thrust of what I was saying. So I was thinking of it more because we were talking about structure, sort of all-encompassing on one hand, that sort of leaves us with very few and very stark choices. And what I was trying to say is that, we all live within the structure already. We can't really get away from it. But what we do have is a space within which we do live, right? So it's not, we're not exhausted by the structure, in that sense. So I think maybe what I'm pointing towards is the role of agency, and perhaps that's what you're calling the politics of hope. And I think maybe also what I'm talking about is the creation of the political as an ongoing project, and I think perhaps you're calling that make life. So I think maybe I'll just leave that there, and if anybody else wants to join in.
Holly, I want to hear from you too. I think this notion of this environmental set of relations that you were talking about seem to be resonating with what Uzma's talking about. If you want to hop in, I just want to give everybody opportunities to,
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a privileged position to be in. I think when white people's livability and sustainability is on the line, then it comes to there's an opportunity to maybe rethink those systems and structures. I mean, I'm hopeful as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement and climate justice, and I've noticed a shift in the way that I teach the racial contract. When I used to teach the racial contract, there used to be a kind of debate about, well, what about all the good things that happen from settler colonization, or aren't you ignoring the good stuff that happens from the racial contract? So that tended to be the kind of focus of the debate with students. Whereas now I'm finding students, when I teach this material, they're saying, oh, we never knew this. We never knew about how white supremacy was so foundational to the creation of the state. And then it becomes a conversation about, okay, well, what structures and systems kind of reinforce that epistemic ignorance? And I think too that it's helpful to think about that there are other ways of kinship, other forms of living, other forms of relationality that persist and exist outside of the racial contract, and maybe that ties in with Uzma's point about agency there as well. But yeah, look, I think I read a lot of hope in Mills, and that when you name the racial contract and that you name epistemic ignorance, that is a way to start rethinking about how can we deconstruct and reconstruct these systems.
Thank you all. I was told that we are on time. So what I would say is that if you all would like, I would love to hear like one final thought from folks. I know that we've talked about hope and epistemic ignorance and questions of pessimism and questions of the racialization of Islam and theodicy and these hard questions. But if you all want to just share one final thought, each one of you, if you feel that you'd like to, it'd be great. And Asaf, we can start with you.
I'm happy to go back to the question of the hopefulness and hopelessness. And I think maybe kind of things that many of us were saying lead to the idea that there is some kind of hopefulness in hopelessness, in a sense, in a practical sense that Mills is talking about, by pointing out or pointing at the hopelessness, at the kind of no way out situation that we're in. Something has already been done. So by speaking about epistemic ignorance, we are already leading to some kind of knowledge of epistemic ignorance, making people aware of that, and that's already, I think, a big step forward. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it kind of one of the small steps that can be achieved. And I think, again, that's one of the strengths of Mills's work and also maybe of that conversation.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Uzma, you gave us this profound discussion of making, I speak of it in terms of making a life, but you dropped those 2 bars on us, and then you were like, I'm gonna drop these bars and then drop the mic. So here's your chance to pick it up again and just share with us some more of your brilliance as we get ready to wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share?
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I think maybe just 2 things to wrap up. One, I think the point that Holly just made around naming the structure, I think that's actually quite a radical act, and there's a lot of agency in that. I think that connects with what you said at the beginning, Biko, about saying the quiet part out loud. I think that's sort of the project in a way that we're involved in as well. And so maybe that's a way for us to come back to thinking about agency and hope and, and making life. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Tommy, it's on you if you want to share anything before we wrap up.
I mean, just to say that I agree that one of the kind of challenges that Mills leaves us with is kinds of how do we live life in relation to the racial contract. And I've been reading Lauren Berlant's last book lately, and the final chapter is about kind of making life, but without wanting the world. And I think that if the racial contract in some ways is foundational to the world, that maybe that's a kind of model. We can't escape the racial contract. And we should always be conscious of the way that it shapes even our best intentions, particularly as if you're a white scholar. But we can still think about what it means to live a life which is not exhausted by the racial contract, even as it is shaped by it.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Holly, would love to hear from you. Your thoughts on indigeneity and different ways. All of this has been so rich, but I want to open up for you to give one final thought.
Oh, look, thank you, everyone. I've gotten so much out of this this discussion this evening, and I agree with what all the previous speakers have said. And it's important, I think, to name, as you say, Biko, the starkness of the racial contract, but also it's important to highlight that Indigenous peoples have survived despite the brutality of settler colonisation, custodianship. Indigenous culture, spirituality, and relationships to country still persist. So there are modes of living that persist and resist outside of the racial contract.
Thank you for that. Christophe, it's on you.
I want to close just with the gift of Mills's work in helping to illuminate the terrain of struggle. That when you understand the racial contract, the emergence of conversations around colorblind racism, and then the activism around police union contracts that facilitate death concretely. It allows you to see that what we see as hypocrisy in the Christian right is actually moral consistency. And so the ability for the racial contract to illuminate terrains of struggle is a gift.
Yes. And as we wrap up, I want to say thank you to each and every one of you all. This was incredibly rich for me, perhaps a little selfishly so. But I really do thank each and every one of you, and perhaps each of us in our own way are a testament to what Charles Mills writes in the 2022 or the 2021 preface to the racial contract. Mills tells us that part of what he appreciates is how he's seen his work show up in different ways over time. And I believe each and every one of you all are testaments to what he has done. And in the same breath, you all are building and critiquing and pushing forward. So I hope that everyone here in the panel and also the participants as well receive something. And here comes my email, but he receives something of use, and if not enjoyed, definitely learned quite a bit from this conversation. So I will say thank you and turn it back over to Laura, because Laura, I don't know how to close out. So I'm going to turn it back over to you and go from there.
Thanks, Biko. Thanks everyone for such a stimulating and insightful discussion. I learned a lot. So grateful for all of you for being here. Thank you for the attendees who came. I don't know. I'd sort of like Biko's final beautiful words to linger in everyone's mind as we sign off here. So I guess the final logistical note is just to let everyone know, my hope is that this conversation will be posted and available online in the next few weeks. Thank you again. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. You all have a wonderful night. And thanks to all of you who are on the panel. Y'all really did make this an amazing conversation. Like, I really do appreciate it. So, thank you all.
Okay.